Everyone in the North Atlantic thought they understood why U-boats were winning until the night a German hydrophone operator listened to a massive convoy and heard something that should have been impossible. 6 ships, buried inside 40 roaring hulls, weren't making a sound, not a whisper, not a vibration, nothing. Inside the Admiralty, experts had spent 3 years insisting that merchant ships could never be silenced, because the very physics of steel, machinery, and propellers made them louder with every mile they sailed. And yet, those impossible ships were slipping past the most advanced submarine ears on Earth, using an idea so primitive, so upside down, that no engineer had ever bothered to try it. And that was the moment the Germans realized something was very, very wrong. Because if this ridiculous idea actually worked, then the ocean, their greatest weapon, was no longer theirs. And the Allies had just found a way to vanish in plain sight. March 1943. The North Atlantic isn't a battlefield, it's a predator. And tonight, it's hungry. Convoy HX-229 claws its way through a sea that wants to break it apart. 40 merchant ships, scattered across 9 columns, heaving up and down 15-foot walls of water. The sky is black, the swell is black, even the wind feels hostile, like something alive and listening. Inside the SS William Eustace, the deck shudders with every plunge. Plates rattle, pots scream against the stove. A loose wrench clatters across the engine room, grating like a metallic heartbeat. To most men aboard, it's just another miserable night on convoy duty. To one man, it's the sound of doom. Tommy Lawson, the ship's cook, braces himself as the Liberty ship tilts hard to port. He's been through enough crossings to know their biggest danger isn't the storm, it's the noise. The constant, relentless grind of a ship pushing against the Atlantic, the vibrations that seep through the hull and travel for miles underwater. Up on the bridge, Captain James Bannerman grips the wheelhouse rail, pretending the darkness is empty. But he knows better. Out here, the moment you move, you make noise. And the moment you make noise, someone below the surface hears you. Because the Atlantic is not silent. The Atlantic is a giant amplifier, and tonight it is carrying the voice of every ship in this convoy straight into the waiting ears of submarines that don't need to see a target, they only need to hear one. Hundreds of feet below, U-boat crews ride in pitch-black silence. No engines, no lights, no talking above a whisper. Their hydrophones are tuned to a single purpose: find the thunder of propellers, the rattle of machinery, the pulse of a merchant hull pushing against water. To the men in those submarines, Convoy HX-229 isn't a formation of ships, it's a symphony of metal suffering, and it is deafening. For the escorts, it's the opposite. The destroyers and corvettes zigzag desperately across the swell, scanning radar and sonar arcs that mean little in waters this deep. Their ears are useless. Their eyes see nothing. The enemy can sit completely still hundreds of feet down, listening with perfect clarity, patient as hunters in a blind. The convoy is blind. The U-boats are not. That imbalance has killed thousands already. It will kill thousands more by summer. And every captain on this route knows exactly why. Merchant ships simply cannot shut up. Their propellers cavitate. Their engines vibrate. Their steel hulls conduct sound like church bells. They don't move through the ocean, they announce themselves. And that's why Bannerman's escorts are nervous. That's why U-boats are smiling in the dark. That's why London is running out of answers. But inside the Eustace, something different is happening. Lawson pauses over a sink full of dishes, one hand pressed against the steel bulkhead. He can feel the vibration, feel it travel through his bones. Other crewmen ignore it. They've learned to. But Lawson listens, really listens. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's the simple fact that he notices things nobody else bothers with. But tonight, for reasons he can't quite explain, the ship feels wrong to him. Too loud, too exposed, too easy to follow. And while he doesn't know it yet, something about that noise, the way it behaves, the way it shifts inside the hull, has already planted a thought in his mind that is going to terrify scientists, infuriate admirals, and change the way ships survive this ocean. Right now, Lawson is just a cook trapped in a storm, but before the month ends, he will force the Royal Navy to question everything it believes about sound, steel, and survival. Because tonight, The Atlantic is screaming, and Lawson is the only one aboard who wonders what might happen if a ship could learn how to shut it up. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a campaign, it was a countdown. Every sunrise meant fewer ships. Every sunset meant fewer sailors. And somewhere in London, men with charts and pencils were calculating a truth nobody dared to say aloud. Britain was running out of time. The numbers told the story long before the Admiralty did. In January, heavy losses. In February, worse. In March, catastrophic. 567,000 tons of Allied shipping vanished beneath the Atlantic that month alone, nearly the entire cargo capacity of the British economy swallowed in 31 days. Warehouses emptied faster than convoys could refill them. Grain silos sat only half-stocked. Fuel reserves shrank to levels so thin they were classified out of fear the public would panic. Inside Downing Street, Winston Churchill reviewed the reports with a face carved from stone. He had stared down Hitler, Mussolini, and the Luftwaffe. He had ordered the evacuation at Dunkirk and watched London burn during the Blitz. But nothing frightened him, not tanks, not bombers, not the Wehrmacht, like the simple, implacable arithmetic of U-boat warfare. His words would later become famous. The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Oh, and everyone in the Western Approaches Command knew exactly why. U-boats didn't need luck. They didn't need perfect weather. They didn't need intelligence reports or code breakers. All they needed was noise. Merchant ships broadcast their position with every turn of their propellers. Even perfectly healthy vessels groaned and shuddered under the strain of wartime loads, steel hulls resonating like giant bells across the deep. And the ocean carried those vibrations astonishing distances. A solitary freighter could be detected 12 miles away. A full convoy? 80. That was the true nightmare. Not the torpedoes, not the Wolfpacks, not the fearless German captains who stalked the night, but the fact that the ocean itself seemed determined to betray the Allies. Engineers had tried to fight back. They fitted destroyers with ASDIC, an early sonar that could detect U-boats directly ahead, but was blind to anything off its bow. A submarine slipping in from the side might as well have been invisible. Scientists built high-frequency direction-finding systems Huff-Duff to track U-boat radio transmissions. It worked brilliantly, until the Wolfpacks realized they didn't need radios once they closed in. From then on, they communicated through the water, through the vibrations of Allied ships themselves. The Admiralty spent millions, wartime millions, the kind that could fund entire fleets looking for a technological solution to noise. They hired mathematicians, physicists, naval architects. Committees formed, published reports, held emergency sessions. Conferences ran until dawn. Nothing worked. Rubber hull coatings? Tested. Failed. Machinery mounts? Too heavy. Too slow to install. Redesigned propellers? Required factories that didn't exist. Hull modifications? Impossible while ships were being built at maximum speed. One classified memo from early 1943 summarized the tragedy perfectly. Without a fundamental redesign of merchant vessels, which wartime production cannot allow, our ships will continue to announce their presence to every U-boat within hearing range. To Otter, it was the kind of statement that drained color from faces, because a fundamental redesign was off the table, and hearing range stretched for miles. The Western Approaches Command, headquartered in Liverpool, felt the pressure most acutely. Their job was simple: shepherd convoys across a killing field. But every escort captain who limped back into harbor brought the same bleak assessment. We can't find them. They can always find us. Dull. Engineers argued that the problem was physics. Admirals argued that the problem was resources. Politicians argued that the problem was German ingenuity. But everyone, on every level, agreed on one thing: the Allies were losing. The curve of losses had turned exponential. U-boats were being built faster. Wolfpacks were coordinating better. New hydrophones were more sensitive, able to read the sea like Braille. And Britain's survival, its literal survival, depended on pushing food and fuel across the Atlantic faster than those submarines could sink it. But by March 1943, for the first time since the war began, that balance tipped the wrong way. Gross tonnage lost exceeded tonnage launched. The reservoir of merchant ships was shrinking. The pipeline feeding Britain was collapsing, and in the corridors of Naval Command, a quiet desperation took root. Some officers masked it with anger. Others buried themselves in reports. A few began whispering the unthinkable. "If nothing changes, we won't make it to autumn," he said. What none of them realized, not the scientists, not the admirals, not the men calculating Britain's food supply, is that the solution wasn't hiding in the Admiralty, or a laboratory, or a dockyard. It was standing in the galley of a Liberty ship, drying his hands on a towel, listening to the hum of an engine no one else noticed. And he was about to flip the entire war on its head. Before he became the most inconvenient man in the Atlantic, Thomas Patrick Lawson was exactly what the world expected him to be: unremarkable. Born in South Boston in 1915, he grew up in a neighborhood where the only thing thinner than a family's patience was their wallet. School was a luxury, not a guarantee. Lawson made it to 14 before the Depression made the decision for him. Books wouldn't pay the rent. Work would. So he left, traded algebra for a frying pan, and spent his teenage years behind the counter of a diner where the air always smelled of burnt coffee and fear of the future. Nobody mistook him for a prodigy. Nobody mistook him for anything. He cooked eggs, scrubbed pans, and learned the quiet skill of hearing things most people tuned out: the hiss of a grill that was running too hot, the faint sputter of a burner about to die, the subtle rhythm of a kitchen operating one mistake away from chaos. That was his world. Not equations, not engineering, just a man paying attention because attention meant survival. When the war came, Lawson didn't enlist out of patriotism. He enlisted because the merchant marine paid $125 a month, 3 times what he made in Boston, 4 times what he might make if the diner closed, which it nearly did every week. A fortune? Hardly, but enough to matter. Enough to stay alive. So, at 26, he signed his name on a stack of papers he barely read, and boarded a ship bound for a job nobody respected: ship's cook. Not gunner, not engineer, not officer. Cook. A role so low on the ladder that even junior deckhands forgot he was technically part of the crew. A role the Navy didn't bother training beyond "don't poison us." A role so irrelevant to warfighting that captains routinely described cooks as logistical noise, the people who existed solely to keep real sailors fed. Lawson didn't complain. He cooked, he cleaned, he listened. And the more crossings he survived, the more he realized he felt something others didn't notice: the heartbeat of the ship. Most men heard noise. Lawson heard patterns. Most men felt vibration. Lawson felt direction. Most men blocked out the engine room. Lawson kept coming back. Sometimes during off-watch hours, when the rest of the crew smoked or slept or wrote letters home, Lawson would wander below decks and sit near the turbines. The heat was suffocating, the kind that scraped moisture out of your throat. The metal roared like a caged animal. Steam hissed from pipes. The deck plates quivered under constant strain. To everyone else, it was misery. To Lawson, it was fascinating. He would close his eyes and try to isolate each sound: the rotary thump of pistons under load, the grinding resonance of the propeller shaft, the faint change in pitch when the ship angled into a heavier swell. If something was out of tune, even slightly, he noticed. "Tommy's going to cook himself alive down there," the first mate once muttered. "He likes the noise," another replied. "He likes being weird," a third added. They weren't wrong. Lawson was weird, a little too curious, a little too attentive, the kind of man who asked questions that made engineers sigh and officers roll their eyes. On paper, he was a liability. In reality, he was the only person aboard who had begun to understand the truth. Ships didn't just travel through water, they spoke through it. And on February 19th, 1943, deep in the mid-Atlantic, Lawson heard something he had never heard before, something that shouldn't have been possible, something that would haunt him until he found an answer. But no one, not the captain, not the crew, not the thousands of men in London fighting the convoy crisis, noticed the cook standing alone in the engine room, tilting his head like he was listening to a ghost. Because why would they? Geniuses don't come from the galley. Revolutions don't start with a frying pan. And wars are not changed by men who peel potatoes. Except this one, February 19th, 1943. Mid-Atlantic, Convoy SC-118 is fighting its way through a rolling black desert of water. When the alarm bell erupts, 3 sharp metallic strikes that freeze every man where he stands. The Liberty ship William Eustis shudders as sailors race to their stations, boots hammering steel. Someone yells, "Torpedo hit," from 2 columns over, and for an instant, every ship in formation seems to hold its breath. Lawson doesn't run. He can't. He's already in motion. He's in the engine room, of course he is, sweat clinging to his shirt, the air thick with steam and the hammering pulse of turbines. The chief engineer, Donald MacLeod, is shouting orders into the din, trying to squeeze another knot of speed out of machinery already on the edge of mutiny. And then Lawson hears it, not the explosion. The ship that got hit is too far for that. What he hears is after a hollow, booming resonance, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. It vibrates through the hull, through the deck plates, through his ribs. Then it stops, completely, instantly, like someone cut a wire. Lawson straightens. MacLeod doesn't even notice. He's too busy keeping the engines alive. But Lawson hears something the engineer doesn't. The absence of sound. The struck ship, the one taking in water, is no longer screaming its mechanical agony into the depths. Its vibrations, once booming through the convoy like a drum, have gone dead. The silence is unnerving. He grabs MacLeod's arm. "The ship that got hit, did you hear it go quiet?" "Wells." MacLeod turns on him with the expression of a man who has absolutely no patience for cooks who ask questions during torpedo alerts. "Of course it went quiet," he snaps. "She's full of bloody water." "No," Lawson insists, fighting to be heard over the turbines. "I mean the vibration. It stopped the moment she flooded. She stopped being loud." "Well." MacLeod stares at him like he's lost his mind. "Water doesn't solve anything, Cook. Water sinks ships. That's what it does." "With mine," Lawson shakes his head. "But it dampened the sound. You felt it. You must have." "And?" MacLeod's face twists. "I must have? Son, I feel a lot of things when a ship blows up. None of them are acoustics. Now get back to your bloody galley. We're the sane, but Lawson can't, because the idea, the insane idea, is forming faster than he can stop it. The struck ship didn't just lose power. It didn't just lose propulsion. It lost noise, every vibration, every note of its acoustic signature, swallowed by the ocean as water flooded the hull and smothered the machinery. Water kills sound better than air, better than steel, better than anything they've tried. What if no? He can't think this. What if you could use that? Controlled flooding. Not enough to sink a ship, just enough to silence it. It's absurd. It's reckless. It's the kind of idea a 14-year-old dropout would come up with. And yet, Lawson can't unhear what he heard. The moment steel hit pressure and the hull filled, the dying vessel vanished from the ocean's acoustic landscape. 1 second it was screaming. The next, it was a ghost. He spends the next 2 weeks obsessed, sketching diagrams in a battered notebook, crude shapes, hull cross-sections, ballast tanks, water-filled chambers wrapping the propeller shaft, arrows indicating vibration flow, notes scrawled in margins. Insulation? I buy. Barrier? Oh, water absorbs better than steel use against hydrophones? End quote. He approaches MacLeod again. MacLeod waves him off. He approaches the first mate. The man laughs in his face. He approaches Captain Bannerman. The captain sighs. "Lawson," he says with exhausted kindness, "I appreciate initiative. I do. But this is naval engineering, not cooking. Leave this to the men who know what they're doing." It's of them, but Lawson has spent his entire life not being listened to. That he can handle. What he can't handle is the memory of that sudden, impossible silence, because in that instant, he felt something he'd never felt in all his crossings. The ocean lose track of a ship, and if water could hide one ship by accident, why couldn't it hide a convoy on purpose? The experts hadn't solved the problem. The admirals hadn't solved the problem. The scientists had declared it unsolvable. Maybe that's why Lawson, the man no one took seriously, was the first to wonder whether the solution wasn't bigger technology or smarter physics, but simply paying attention to what the ocean had been trying to say all along. He just needed anyone to listen back. And if nobody in the Eustis would hear him, he would go straight to the one place where someone had to, even if they threw him out, even if they arrested him, even if it was suicide. Because the Atlantic wasn't killing ships with torpedoes. It was killing them with sound. And Lawson had just discovered a way to shut the ocean up. Liverpool, March 24th, 1943. The William Eustis has barely tied up to the quay when Lawson steps onto the gangway with a decision already carved into him like a scar. He has 48 hours of shore leave. Men normally spend it drinking, sleeping, or pretending for a moment that the war is far away. Lawson marches straight toward it. He doesn't tell McLeod. He doesn't tell Bannerman. He doesn't tell anyone, because he knows exactly what they'll say. You're a cook. Stay in your lane. We have today. But Lawson has spent 2 weeks replaying that impossible silence in his head. 2 weeks sketching diagrams that no one would look at. 2 weeks trying and failing to convince anyone that the ocean itself had just revealed a weakness in hydrophone warfare. If the people on his ship wouldn't listen, then he would go straight to the people who had no choice but to. Western Approaches Command Headquarters, Derby House. The most restricted naval facility in northern Britain. The nerve center of the entire Atlantic War. A place where admirals decide which convoys live and which convoys die. Lawson pushes through the front doors with the posture of a man who definitely does not belong there. 2 Royal Navy shore patrolmen spot him instantly. Oi, you stop. CNS. One grabs his arm. What's your business here, mate? Lawson's voice cracks between fear and fury. I need to speak to someone about convoy noise. Mine is still. That earns him a laugh the wrong kind. You and every bloody crank in Liverpool, the patrolman mutters. Clear off. If you texted him, but Lawson plants his feet. I have an idea that can keep U-boats from hearing us. 2. That gets their attention, not the good kind. You don't walk into Derby House and talk about secret bloody warfare systems, the other says. You're coming with us. 18-1 daughter. They start to drag him out. Lawson struggles. Not violently, just desperately. Please, I'm serious. I've seen something. A ship goes quiet when, we've heard enough, the patrolman grunts. And that is when a voice cuts across the lobby. Hold on. End quote. A man turns toward them, a young Royal Navy officer in a dark greatcoat, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, posture stiff from too many nights in the North Atlantic. Commander Peter Gretton, one of the most experienced escort group commanders in the entire Navy. A man who, 2 weeks earlier, lost 13 ships to a Wolfpack attack he never saw coming. A man who has buried too many men because convoys are too loud and U-boats are too quiet. What did he say about convoy noise? Gretton asks. The patrolmen hesitate. Just another Yank spouting nonsense, sir. As Gretton steps closer. Let the man speak, he said offer. For the first time, Lawson faces someone who might actually listen. He explains everything fast, breathless, tangled, but honest. The torpedoed ship, the silence after flooding, the way machinery noise vanished when water filled the hull, his sketches, his idea, not to strengthen the ships, but to dampen them. Water, not steel, absorption, not armor. Gretton doesn't interrupt. He crosses his arms, jaw tightening as he thinks. When Lawson finishes, there is a long pause. Then, that, Gretton says slowly, is the most ridiculous thing I've heard all month. Lawson deflates. But, Gretton adds, ridiculous ideas are sometimes the only ones we haven't tried. Andorra, the patrolman looks stunned. Lawson looks like he might collapse from relief. Gretton lowers his voice. Come with me. And don't say another word until we're somewhere private. Oh. He leads Lawson through a side corridor, past naval ratings who cast suspicious looks at the unknown merchant seaman trailing behind a commander. Down a stairwell, into a small operations room littered with convoy charts, U-boat sighting reports, and untouched mugs of cold tea. Then Gretton turns sharply. Show me the notebook, Twitter. Lawson hands it over with trembling fingers. Gretton flips through page after page of amateur diagrams, messy, incomplete, borderline childish, and yet his face changes. He stops on the drawing of water-filled chambers braced against machinery mounts. You're telling me, Gretton says, that if we surround the noisiest parts of a ship with controlled water, We can muffle the sound before it escapes into the sea? Aye, yes, Lawson whispers. If we do it right. With Theory 1s, Gretton taps the page with 2 fingers. This is unauthorized, illegal, potentially dangerous. Allo, Lawson swallows. So is losing the Atlantic. 2. Gretton exhales a long, pained breath. Then, quietly, if you're wrong, I'll look like a fool. If you're right, we may have just found the only idea in 3 years worth risking everything on. S. He closes the notebook. Very well, Mr. Lawson. Let's test your theory. Here's .com. And just like that, a commander with everything to lose and a cook with nothing to his name walk out of Derby House carrying an idea the entire Admiralty had already declared impossible. What happens next will break rules, terrify engineers, and set the stage for the most reckless experiment of. There are rules in wartime navies, thick manuals full of them, written by men who believe order is the backbone of victory. And then there are nights when rules become luxuries nobody can afford. For Commander Peter Gretton, this is one of those nights. He waits until after dusk to bring Lawson into the dry dock at Liverpool. Floodlights burn overhead, glaring off the chipped paint of a small corvette undergoing repairs. HMS Sunflower. Her hull sits exposed, braced on steel supports, the propeller shaft housing gleaming like a spine. This, Gretton mutters, is where we break the law. Spy. Lawson stares at the warship in awe. He's been at sea for years, but has never stood beside a vessel taken apart like this, its guts showing, its secrets exposed. A lieutenant in grease-stained overalls steps forward. Commander, he says, wiping his hands. If this is what you hinted at earlier, I want it on record that I consider this madness. I was no. Duly noted, Gretton replies. Lieutenant Whitby, meet Mr. Lawson. Poke. Whitby raises an eyebrow. The cook? To Iwell. Lawson answers, before Gretton can. The one with the ridiculous idea. Yes. With you no, Whitby snorts. Brilliant. We're risking our careers on a galley boy's sketchbook. 1. Gretton's tone sharpens. Lieutenant, we're risking our careers because our current methods are failing. Now shut up and listen. Argrad. Whitby obeys barely. Gretton gestures toward the propeller shaft. Lawson, show him. If you one play, Lawson opens his notebook. His hands are shaking, but his voice is steady. He points to the crude drawings. Hydrophones hear 2 things: cavitation from the propellers and vibration from machinery. We can't fix cavitation without redesigning the blade, but we can stop machinery vibration from reaching the hull. The reason looking to have it. Whitby squints. With water? I am, quote, yes, Lawson says. Water absorbs vibration far better than air or steel. If we create water-filled chambers around the loudest structures, we can stop sound at the source. Maesta, Whitby laughs. And if we miscalculate, the ship becomes a 900-ton bathtub. Arc, Gretton cuts in. We're not flooding compartments. We're adding sealed water chambers, external insulation. Well, Lawson nods. Think of it like a cushion. A heavy, liquid cushion. So, Whitby runs a hand through his hair. If anyone finds out, they won't, Gretton says. We test tonight. No paperwork, no approvals. .com. The lieutenant exhales. God help us. And they get to work. It's crude engineering closer to improvisation than naval architecture. They weld empty oil drums around the propeller shaft housing and fill them with seawater. They lash sandbags against the engine mounts to simulate the weight distribution they'd need. They debate, argue, sweat, and burn themselves on hot steel. Strange shapes take form around the ship's backbone, like armor plates designed by a madman. By midnight, the dry dock smells of welding fumes and seawater. Lawson's hands are blistered. Whitby's uniform is ruined, and Gretton has broken at least 3 Admiralty regulations. Stand back, Whitby finally says. We'll lower her into the river at dawn. 1. Lawson barely sleeps. March 28th, 1943. Sunflower glides into the murky Mersey River and accelerates to low speed. 300 yards away, Submarine HMS Trespasser submerges. Hydrophones active. Gretton, Whitby, and Lawson stand on deck, breath held. Minutes pass. A signal lamp flashes from the submarine. Whitby groans. Heard you clear as day. Cavitation normal. Machinery resonance strong. Dollar. Failure. A waste of bloody time, Whitby mutters, but Lawson frowns hard. It drained. Itzdel. What? And the chambers. They were watertight in dry dock, but water must have leaked through the seams once she was afloat. Is 9. Whitby throws up his hands. Fantastic. We've built the world's worst plumbing system. All arrests. Lawson grips the rail. Seal them. Weld proper chambers. Try again. After 7. Gretton looks between the two men. Lieutenant? He's abacked. Whitby hesitates. Then, if we get caught, sir, we're finished. With that, we're in. Gretton steps closer. If we don't get caught and this works, we save ships instead of writing letters to widows. 3 more days. Aye, Graham. Whitby stares at him, then nods. 3 more days. Well, they rebuild everything from scratch. Steel chambers this time, not drums. Fully sealed. Bladders filled with water braced against the engine mounts. Every weld triple-checked. Every leak patched. Every ounce of discretion exhausted. April 2nd, 1943. Sunflower pushes into deeper water at full speed. Trespasser submerges 1,000 yards away this time, well outside the range the first test had easily broadcast to. Silence stretches. Waiting becomes agony. Then Trespasser surfaces. A flag signal rises. Whitby reads it aloud. Lost you at 400 yards. Signal faded into ambient noise. Could not reacquire. RY. For a moment, nobody speaks. Then Gretton's face drains of color. Oh God, he whispers. It works. Weighed 1 salve. End quote. Whitby's jaw drops. He looks at Lawson like he's seeing him for the first time. You actually did it, he mutters. A cook, aye. Where? Lawson exhales shakily. No, we did it. He's seeing? Gretton grips the rail, knuckles white. Gentlemen, he says softly, we are now in possession of a technology the Admiralty does not know exists. Built on a warship without authorization, and capable of changing the entire balance of the Atlantic. Brains, he turns to Lawson, and now we have to tell them. Rydens, Lawson nods, or the ocean will keep doing their job for them. Here lies, April 3rd, 1943. London. If Derby House was the brain of the Atlantic War, the Admiralty in London was its spine rigid, unyielding, and extremely hostile to anyone attempting to bend it. Yet this morning, Peter Gretton walks straight into it with a man who has no rank, no credentials, and no permission to be here. A cook is about to challenge the Royal Navy. They pass through layers of uniformed officers who stare daggers at Lawson. He has no insignia on his sleeves, no cap. He looks like someone who should be delivering food trays, not walking beside a commander. But Gretton doesn't slow down. Keep your head down, Gretton murmurs. Lawson nods. His hands won't stop trembling. At the end of a long corridor stands the door to the Admiralty boardroom, where decisions that determine the fate of nations are made. When Gretton pushes it open, the atmosphere inside changes like pressure dropping in a submarine. Around a polished table sit Rear Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief, Western approaches, along with 3 senior officers and a civilian in a dark suit, with the posture of a man who believes physics itself takes orders from him. Dr. Harold Burris, Chief Naval Architect of the Admiralty, the man whose reports declared convoy noise unsolvable. The moment Burris sees Lawson, his eyebrows rise. A merchant seaman? Commander, what is the meaning of this? Old do. Gretton doesn't flinch. Sir, with respect, this man has made an observation we cannot ignore. B. Ender 7. Ender 7. Horton gestures, impatiently. Explain. People I-9. Gretton does. He describes the first test on Sunflower, then the second how a submarine lost them at 400 yards. He gives ranges, decibel shifts, hydrophone feedback. He presents it like a man trying hard not to sound insane. Burris interrupts, voice sharp. Impossible. Machinery vibration cannot be dampened by flooding. Water increases mass, changes balance, invites corrosion. We didn't flood compartments, Gretton cuts in. We built sealed chambers. Well, BR. Unauthorized chambers, Burris snaps. On a warship, based on a sketch from a man with no training. What thousand? Horton glances at Lawson. Mr. Lawson, is that correct? They argies. Lawson feels 30 pairs of eyes drilling into him. His throat dries, his palms sweat, but he forces himself to speak. Yes, sir. I heard something when a torpedoed ship flooded. The vibration stopped. I thought, if we could control where the water sits. You cannot simply, Burris begins. But Horton raises a hand. Let him finish. Doesn't. Lawson swallows. Water absorbs vibration. Better than steel. Better than air. If we place it around the loudest machinery, we stop the ship from broadcasting its position. Well, a long silence follows. Then Burris laughs. Actually laughs. This violates basic engineering principles, he says. Water inside a ship's structure introduces stability risks, mass displacement issues, and cannot be maintained. Even if it worked and it does not, the installation time alone would cripple the dockyards. I have 7. Gretton leans forward. With respect, Doctor, you said the problem was impossible. We've shown it isn't. You have shown nothing, Burris snaps. One test on a river, under controlled conditions, against a cooperative submarine. Watch it. In Debelu. Gretton's temper finally cracks. In March, we lost 567,000 tons of shipping because we let U-boats hear us from 50 miles away. If we treat every new idea like treason, we'll lose this war before summer. 2S. Captain Edmund Rushbrook, Director of Naval Intelligence, slams his hand on the table. Commander, you are out of line. No, Gretton says quietly. I am out of options. Horton stands. The room falls silent. Enough. Goy. He steps toward Lawson. You believe this can be scaled? Not just to one corvette, but across a convoy? Wise. Lawson nods. Yes, sir. The structure is simple. Welded chambers, water bladders. Any dockyard crew could install them. If we test 6 ships, scattered across a formation, we'll know within days. He's wide. Rushbrook looks horrified. Admiral, we cannot gamble convoys on the word of... Horton cuts him off. Tell me, Captain, which is the greater gamble? Testing something new, or continuing a strategy that is losing us the Atlantic? If you want to, no one answers. The silence hangs like a torpedo waiting to strike. Burris tries one last time. Even if this idea has merit, implementation is impossible. 2,000 merchant ships. Dockyard capacity is already. We don't need 2,000, Lawson interjects softly. We need 6. Horton turns fully to him. 6? 2. They're hot of the marg. Yes, sir. 6 placements inside one convoy. If the U-boats ignore the modified ships and hit the loud ones, we'll have our answer. It's not. A ripple of disbelief moves through the room. Gretton watches Lawson with something close to pride. Horton walks back to his seat, hands clasped behind his back. When he speaks, his voice is low but decisive. Commander Gretton, Mr. Lawson, you will retrofit 6 merchant vessels in convoy on 184, sailing in 8 days. Why? Rushbrook's eyes widen. Admiral, 1. It factored 9. Horton ignores him. Lieutenant Burris will provide limited technical oversight. If this works, we proceed fleet-wide. He pauses. If it fails? Commander, you will spend the rest of the war commanding a minesweeper in the Orkney Islands. One's Tam. Gretton bows his head. Crystal clear, sir. We're even. Horton's gaze shifts to Lawson. And you, Mr. Lawson, I don't know if you're a genius or a lunatic, but I know we're desperate. He steps closer. Don't make me regret this. Well, Lawson exhales, voice steady for the first time. I won't, sir. To Eversev. The meeting ends, and with it, 3 years of consensus collapses under the weight of one impossible idea. History doesn't turn with a roar. Sometimes it turns with a whisper. April 22nd, 1000, 943. Liverpool. The dockyard reeks of steam, hot steel, and terror disguised as urgency. Welding torches hiss through the night as mechanics crawl over 6 merchant ships like doctors racing to save patients already on the operating table. The modifications look absurd: industrial chambers bolted to propeller housings, water-filled bladders wedged against engine mounts, pipes that seem to lead nowhere. No one outside this tiny circle knows what these structures are. No one knows what they're for. No one knows the future of the Atlantic War is being built in secret, with tools borrowed off a repair crew and materials scrounged from storage yards. In 64 frantic hours, the work is done. 6 ships, 6 experiments, 6 chances to prove that the Atlantic can be silenced. When dawn breaks, Convoy on 184 slips out of Liverpool and into the open sea. 43 merchant ships spread across 9 columns, escorted by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. The modified vessels are scattered throughout the formation. 2 to starboard, 2 to port, 2 in the center. No pattern, no hint. Nothing a German submarine commander could detect, even if he stared at the convoy all day. Because the test isn't about visibility, it's about sound. Lawson stands on the deck of his own ship, the William Eustace, watching Liverpool fade into a gray smear behind them. He feels the vibration under his boots, but now something is different. The hum is softer, muted, as though someone wrapped the engine in blankets. For the first time in months, he allows himself to hope. Gretton, aboard the escort ship HMS Vedette, feels no such comfort. He knows this convoy is bait. The Germans read departure schedules as efficiently as any naval officer. Somewhere out there, a Wolfpack is already spreading out across the convoy's expected route, ready to strike from the depths. What if Burris is right? His XO asks quietly, what if we've risked 6 ships for nothing? As Gretton doesn't look away from the horizon. Then we lose 6 ships, he says. Maybe more. But if Lawson is right, we change the war. End quote. 2 days later, 600 miles west of Ireland, a Type 7 U-boat, U-264, drifts silently beneath the surface. Her captain, Kapitän Lieutenant Hartwig, studies his charts. For 6 hours, his hydrophone operator has tracked the distant rumble of a convoy, loud, unmistakable, irresistible. But something is wrong. Very wrong. Signal weakening again, Herr Kalun, the operator whispers, adjusting the headphones. Some ships strong, others fade too quickly. Frowns. Interference? Is the Brandt? No, sir. Intermittent signatures. The convoy sounds uneven. Uneven? Convoys never sound uneven. A normal convoy is a single, monstrous acoustic blob, 40 engines beating in chaotic unison. But this one keeps thinning out, disappearing, reappearing. Like broken radio static. Looks orders the boat to periscope depth. Through the lens, he sees them. The distant silhouettes of 40 merchantmen surging through the night, columns rising and falling with the swell. But his ears tell a different story. His hydrophones should be detecting all 40. Instead, he hears 27. 13 ships silent. Impossible. Unless. No. There is no unless. Convoys don't just go quiet. Curses under his breath. Very well. We target the loud ones. Haver. With muzzed, he sends the contact report. Other U-boats move in, positioning themselves for the kill. April 27th, 0140 hours. A torpedo streaks through the dark and slams into a merchant hull mid-column. A second ship goes up minutes later, flames reaching for the sky. Men scramble to lifeboats. Escorts race to chase phantom contacts they cannot hear. For 18 brutal hours, U-boats swarm on 184 like wolves descending on a wounded herd. 9 merchant ships vanish beneath the waves. 47,000 tons of cargo lost. Lifeboats scatter across the black water. The convoy bleeds badly. But amid the smoke and chaos, something begins to stand out. Lawson's ship is untouched. So is the second modified ship. And the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. 43 ships in the convoy. 9 sunk. 6 silent ones completely ignored. At dawn, as the last echoes of gunfire fade across the waves, Gretton stares at the damage reports from the bridge of Vidette. His hands shake. 9 ships gone. 0 modified ships hit. Not by luck, not by chance, but because U-boats never knew they were there. Across the Atlantic, the Admiralty receives Gretton's signal: short, clinical, devastating. Modified vessels. No enemy engagement. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate fleet-wide implementation. Burris sits in stunned silence. Rushbrook mutters a quiet curse. Horton closes his eyes. The test is over. The impossible has happened. The Atlantic, once an amplifier of death, has been forced to whisper, and a cook saw it first. Before on 184, the curve of the Atlantic War looked like a cliff the Allies were falling off. After on 184, that curve bent subtly at first, then violently until the hunters realized they were the ones being stalked. The numbers began shifting almost immediately. In early March 1943, German hydrophones could detect a convoy at 11 to 12 nautical miles long before escorts could sense anything in return. A Wolfpack could assemble, attack, break contact, then resume tracking from a distance. It was a slaughter line disguised as an ocean. By late May, only 6 weeks after the first retrofits, the detection range for modified ships had collapsed to barely half a mile. Half a mile. From 12 miles to half. A 95% reduction in the one metric that decided life or death in the Atlantic. That single shift detonated inside the German command structure like a silent bomb. Suddenly, U-boats couldn't form firing solutions, couldn't locate columns, couldn't time simultaneous attacks, couldn't even tell whether they were tracking the real convoy or chasing echoes through the swell. The Wolfpack tactic, the heart of Admiral Karl Donitz's entire naval doctrine, depended on hydrophones acting as the long-range ears of the submarine fleet. But now, those ears were going deaf. Inside the U-boat bunkers at Lorient, Street Nazaire, and La Rochelle, captains stumbled into post-patrol briefings exhausted, confused, and furious. They reported inconsistent convoy signatures, the polite term for what was actually happening. They were losing the ability to hear their prey. One report from U-954, filed by a hydrophone operator who barely survived when his boat was sunk, put it bluntly: "Sometimes we heard convoy noises from far away. Other times a ship was almost upon us before detection. It was as if the ocean had fallen silent." 12. Silence, the very thing U-boats feared most, because silence meant vulnerability. The Royal Navy pounced. When U-boats had to creep within a mile of a convoy to detect it, they were suddenly inside the range of ASDIC detection. Inside radar range. Inside visual range. Inside the jaws of the very destroyers they once outran. For the first time since the war began, the sea itself was pushing submarine hunters forward instead of holding them back. The shift was so immediate, so dramatic, that operational researchers inside Western Approaches Command ran the numbers 3 times to ensure they weren't hallucinating. Before acoustic dampening, 31% of merchant ships attacked in a Wolfpack engagement were sunk. U-boats suffered an average of 1 dose losses per convoy battle. After acoustic dampening spread across the fleet, merchant loss rate plummeted to 4. 500C. U-boat losses surged to 4. Haute pair. Engagement. A 4-fold increase. The ocean hadn't become safer. The ocean had become a trap. By May 1943, the Germans walked straight into it. Historians call it the turning point. Perfences, Tangenzeit, Toursum. U-boat crews call it something else. Black May. In a single month, the Allies sank 41 submarines, 1/4 of the entire operational fleet. 25% of Germany's best captains, best boats, best hydrophone operators, gone. Not damaged, not forced back to port, destroyed. The shift was so brutal that Donitz himself wrote in his war diary on May 24th, "The enemy has achieved technical supremacy in acoustic detection. Convoys have become nearly invisible to hydrophone surveillance. The old certainties have vanished. Wave era. The old certainties that convoys would always be loud, always be vulnerable, always be hunted by ears sharper than any machine the Allies possessed. Gone. not because of a new radar, not because of a code break, not because of a new escort carrier or weapon, but because one line cook noticed an impossible silence and refused to ignore it. By July 1943, 847 merchant ships had received the new acoustic dampening system. Dockyard crews perfected the installation process, shaving the time from 64 hours down to 48. Steel consumption was minimal, cost was negligible compared to the price of losing ships, and the impact was catastrophic for the wrong side. Convoy losses dropped to numbers no commander had dared dream of in 1942. Wolfpacks lost cohesion. Boats died faster than Germany could replace them. Submariners, once the elite hunters of the Reich, now feared approaching convoys at all. The Atlantic, for the first time in 4 years, belonged to the Allies. And nobody outside a handful of officers understood why. Nobody knew the secret. Nobody knew whose idea it had been. Nobody knew that the greatest strategic shift in the ocean war began not in a laboratory, nor in an Admiralty planning room, but in the engine room heat of a Liberty ship, when a cook heard the ocean go quiet. Once the Admiralty accepted that Lawson's idea truly worked, the question was no longer, is this possible? But, how fast can we turn the entire Atlantic silent? End quote. The answer shocked even the optimists. Unlike radar, unlike sonar, unlike escort carriers or long-range bombers, Lawson's innovation wasn't a marvel of industry. It didn't require new factories, new alloys, or new electrical systems. It didn't need scientists with doctorates or engineers with clearance levels that reached into the stratosphere. It required steel chambers. It required water. And it required courage. The courage to rip open ships already at sea, weld untested structures around critical machinery, and trust that the ocean, which had betrayed them for years, could be forced to switch sides. By late April, the Admiralty sent urgent cables to dockyards across Britain, Canada, and Iceland. Their content was astonishingly simple. Begin acoustic dampening modifications. Priority, highest. 2. There were no detailed blueprints, only sketches taken from Lawson's notebook, hastily formalized by engineers who were still reeling from the idea that a cook had beaten them to the solution. Even so, production lines adapted almost overnight. Dockworkers welded through fog, through cold, through exhaustion. Engineers crawled through spaces so tight they bruised themselves against the machinery. Merchant captains watched skeptically as strange new shapes appeared around their engines, their propellers, their hull interiors. And yet, ship after ship emerged from the docks humming with a new kind of silence. Installation times fell rapidly. The first 6 ships took 64 hours each. The next dozens took 54, then 50. By midsummer, crews could complete the job in 48 hours, the time it took to load cargo. It was absurdly efficient, almost embarrassingly simple, and devastatingly effective. Germany's naval intelligence tried desperately to understand why the Atlantic had turned against them. They analyzed surviving hydrophone logs. They interrogated captured merchant sailors and escort crews. They dissected wreckage, studied propeller fragments, reviewed sonar reports, and found nothing. Because the secret was hidden inside ships still afloat, not in the debris of ships that sank. The U-boats kept dying. The convoys kept living. And Donitz kept demanding answers that never came. Every day, more ships left Allied ports, with Lawson's system installed. First, dozens, then hundreds. By July 1943, a staggering 847 merchant ships had received acoustic dampening, nearly 1/10 of the entire Allied merchant fleet. These weren't experimental outliers anymore. They were a movement, a quiet revolution. As implementation spread, the Atlantic changed character. The convoys that once roared like mechanical thunderstorms now moved with uneven silence, some ships still loud, others nearly undetectable. This unpredictability shattered Wolfpack tactics. U-boats could no longer rely on hydrophones alone. They had to close distance dangerously, so exposing themselves to escorts, aircraft, and radar-equipped destroyers. The Reich's most lethal weapon had been forced out of the shadows and into the kill zone. Meanwhile, for the first time since 1939, the Allies could breathe. Convoy commanders reported crossings with 0 losses. Escort captains wrote astonished letters home. Shipbuilders celebrated the fact that tonnage launched was finally outpacing tonnage sunk. The tipping point had passed. The avalanche had begun. And at the heart of it wasn't a laboratory breakthrough or a classified technology. It was a cook's observation, scaled to an empire. By autumn 1943, acoustic dampening was no longer controversial. It was doctrine. Training manuals were updated. Dockyard schedules were rewritten. Operational planning assumed that convoys would be harder to detect. The sensational part? Almost no one outside naval circles knew why the Atlantic had become survivable again. To the public, it looked like strategy. To historians, it would later look like inevitability. But inside the Admiralty, every officer knew the truth. The turning point came from a man with no rank, no pedigree, and no right to change the war. But who changed it anyway? Victory never knocks on the door of the men who make it possible. It simply moves on quietly, efficiently, leaving those men standing in the shadow of events too large for any one life to contain. Thomas Patrick Lawson learned this truth earlier than most. When the Admiralty finally acknowledged the success of acoustic dampening, they did not summon Lawson to London with fanfare. A clerk simply delivered a typed order: report to Liverpool Dockyard for technical supervision. There was no rank attached. No promotion. Just a reminder that he was a civilian cook whose idea had unexpectedly become indispensable. Lawson didn't complain. He'd never expected attention, but even silence has weight. For months, he moved between ships like a phantom engineer, training dockyard crews, explaining dampening placement, demonstrating how water chambers should behave under load. Some engineers respected him. Others resented him. A few couldn't hide their discomfort at being instructed by a man with no formal schooling. One senior architect muttered within earshot, "God help the Navy when line cooks are rewriting naval doctrine." Lawson didn't answer. He had never needed their approval, only their willingness to listen. And in time, even that was unnecessary. By the end of 1943, the system no longer needed him. The designs had been formalized. Production was standardized. Entire departments existed to manage the work he had pioneered in a notebook stained with engine room grease. That was when the Admiralty called him in, not to celebrate him, but to dismiss him gently from the center of the storm he had created. A quiet ceremony. A modest room. A medal placed in his hand. The British Empire Medal, awarded for service to naval innovation. "So is quite work." Horton shook his hand. Gretton nodded. A photographer took a single picture never published, and just like that, Thomas Lawson's war was over. He shipped home to Boston on a transport vessel he himself had helped silence. When he stepped onto American soil, no reporters waited for him. No parade passed through the streets. The Merchant Marine had no policy for honoring civilian innovation. They barely had a policy for acknowledging survival. So Lawson went back to what he understood: work that didn't require applause. He opened a diner in Dorchester. Small, modest. A handful of tables, a creaking counter, the smell of frying eggs drifting out into the cold New England mornings. Customers knew him as Tom. Some recognized he was a veteran. None imagined he had altered the outcome of the longest naval campaign in history. He married, raised 3 children, laughed with neighbors, paid bills, lived quietly, almost anonymously. And when the war ended, naval historians wrote volumes about radar, about Huff Duff, about escort carriers and code-breaking and strategic bombing. The great turning points were mapped, debated, commemorated, but Lawson's name never made the footnotes. Not because he'd been erased, because he never stepped forward to claim his place. He kept his wartime notebook in a drawer beside old receipts. When asked about the Battle of the Atlantic, he waved away the topic. "I just noticed something," he'd say. "Other people did the real work. Mine is hard, but there are truths men cannot bury forever." When Lawson died in 1991, his obituary in the Boston Globe described him as a restaurant owner, a husband, a father, and a veteran of the Merchant Marine. Nothing more. And yet, on the morning of his funeral, 3 elderly British naval officers appeared at the servicemen with lined faces and medals polished by years of memory. They had crossed an ocean to stand beside a coffin almost no one recognized. Before they left, one of them slipped a folded note into Lawson's casket. It held only 5 words. "Because of you, we came home." Wars do not end when the guns fall silent. Some victories keep unfolding long after the men who shaped them have returned to ordinary lives. Lawson's discovery was one of those victories, quiet, persistent, and utterly transformative. After 1943, as acoustic dampening spread through Allied convoys, the method evolved. Engineers refined the crude water chambers into standardized units. Naval architects redesigned internal layouts to maximize sound absorption. Shipyards developed new protocols for machinery isolation, making silence an intentional part of construction rather than a desperate retrofit. But the most profound change was conceptual. For centuries, naval warfare treated sound as a natural byproduct of movement, inevitable, uncontrollable, uncontested. The ocean was assumed to be a transparent medium to sound, a perfect betrayer. Lawson shattered that assumption. He proved that noise was not destiny. It was a variable, one that could be shaped, manipulated, weaponized. The idea didn't stay confined to merchant ships. By 1944, Royal Navy scientists began adapting Lawson's principles for escorts and combat vessels. They experimented with flexible machinery mounts, redesigned shaft bearings, and hull compartments engineered specifically to control resonance. The United States Navy took note, adopting similar measures, and when the war ended, they did not stop. In 1950, almost without public attention, the U.S. Navy introduced a revolutionary system based on the same physics Lawson had sketched in the pages of his notebook: Prairie Masker. Instead of static water chambers, Prairie Masker used compressed air released through tiny perforations along the hull to create a curtain of microscopic bubbles. These bubbles disrupted the transmission of machinery noise into the surrounding water. Submarines trying to track U.S. warships found their hydrophones overwhelmed, not by silence this time, but by a controlled field of interference. The lineage was unmistakable. Different method, same principle. Break the acoustic signature, and you break the enemy's ability to hunt you. Prairie Masker became standard across U.S. destroyers, frigates, and surface combatants. Entire generations of officers learned the system without ever knowing whose idea had paved the way. Manuals described it as a milestone in naval innovation, yet the origin story never traced back to a Liberty ship cook who noticed a dead vessel go quiet. But history has a way of rediscovering the overlooked. By the 1972nd, retired British officers began writing memoirs about the Battle of the Atlantic. A few lines appeared here and there, mentions of an unusual dampening system, a trial on Convoy on 184, a civilian contribution of note. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. In 1978, a naval historian pulled that thread. He tracked Lawson to his small diner in Dorchester. The man behind the grill, spatula in hand, looked nothing like the innovator who had helped dismantle the Wolfpack threat. Lawson tried to wave the historian off, claiming his role was small, barely worth mentioning. Well, Asco. The historian disagreed. He interviewed escorts, dockyard officers, Admiralty staff. He pieced together memos, test logs, casualty reports, wartime letters. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth resurfaced. During the most desperate month of the Atlantic War, a man with no formal training had solved the problem every expert believed unsolvable. What followed wasn't fame. Lawson had no interest in it, but recognition in the places where it mattered most. In 2011, the United States Naval Academy added his story to its leadership curriculum, not as a lesson in engineering, not even as a tale of wartime ingenuity, but as a warning against the arrogance of expertise, a warning about the cost of ignoring unconventional ideas, a warning that the most dangerous phrase in any organization isn't, "That's impossible," but "We've always done it this way." Modern navies, with their stealth coatings and sonar arrays and digitally calibrated propulsion systems, still fight a war Lawson helped rewrite. Every ship that slips quietly across the sea carries a fraction of his insight, a faint echo of the moment he realized the ocean could be taught to keep a secret. He never claimed the credit. He never sought the spotlight. He never understood the scale of what he had done. But history does, And it remembers in its own way. Because every sailor who crossed the Atlantic safely after 1943 did so under the protection of an idea born not in a laboratory, but in the heat and noise of a Liberty ship engine room, an idea no one in power expected, and no one in uniform would forget. History likes its heroes loud. It celebrates the generals who commanded armies, the admirals who shaped oceans, the inventors whose patents reshaped nations. It writes their names in books, carves them into monuments, anchors them into public memory. But war is not won by the loud. It's won by the ones no one notices, by the men hunched over machinery at 3 a.m, by the sailors who never see combat yet keep ships alive across thousands of miles, by cooks who hear something strange in a moment of chaos and refuse to look away. Lawson never fired a shot, never commanded a ship, never saw himself as more than a man working a job he needed. And yet, when historians trace the arc of the Atlantic War from catastrophe in early 1943 to dominance in late 1943, from convoys slaughtered by Wolfpacks to U-boats dying faster than Germany could replace them, they find a turning point not in strategy, not in technology, not in production. They find it in a moment of silence. The instant a dying ship stopped screaming into the water, and one man asked the question nobody else had bothered to ask. What if silence is a weapon? Telvercast. That question saved thousands. That question crippled the Wolfpacks. That question bent the trajectory of the longest naval campaign in modern history. And that question came from a cook. Lawson's story is not about genius. It's about attention. Raw, stubborn, unglamorous attention. It's about refusing to ignore the details everyone else steps over. It's about understanding that breakthroughs don't arrive as revelations. They arrive as whispers that only a few people bother to hear. His idea wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even correct by the standards of the experts who mocked it. It simply worked. And because it worked, convoys that should have died lived. Ships that should have burned reached port. Sailors who would have vanished beneath the waves watched their children grow up. An entire front of the war, one that threatened to starve Britain into collapse, pivoted on an idea scribbled in a grease-stained notebook. Lawson never asked for credit. He never asked for recognition. He only asked for someone to listen. Today, modern warships glide across oceans, wrapped in sophisticated acoustic dampening systems, descendants of the crude water chambers Lawson sketched 80 years ago. Naval academies teach the principles he discovered without knowing his name. Analysts speak of acoustic management and propulsion masking, as though these concepts were born in classrooms rather than in the heat of a Liberty ship engine room. But somewhere beneath those layers of technology is the same truth. Sometimes, the difference between defeat and victory is one person who notices what everyone else missed, and sometimes the ocean stays silent. Because a cook once taught it how. If a cook with no rank, no training, and no reason to be heard could change the entire battle of the Atlantic, then here's the real question. How many other war-changing ideas were lost simply because the wrong person had the right thought? Tell me in the comments. Do you think militaries today would recognize a Lawson or ignore him the same way the Admiralty almost did? Would a modern Navy listen to the unnoticed voice in the room, or would it bury the idea before it ever reached the water? I read every comment. Your perspective shapes what forgotten story we uncover next. If you want more untold moments like this one, moments where the war didn't turn because of a general or a weapon, but because of a single human being, hit subscribe, share this video, and stay with us. Because in the shadows of history, the smallest voices often make the loudest break in the tide.